Hello team, welcome back to our nutrition education discussion. Last week we spoke about eating meat and vegetables, nuts and seeds, some fruit, a little starch and no sugar. Basically what we were talking about there is eating whole foods, okay, so things that haven't been particularly processed by man, so nothing's been added or taken away from them, they're just as they are in nature. The point for homework last week was to have a look, think of those different foods, think about the food that you currently eat and then compare and think how close are you to that list, where are you different. So if you've not done that yet, that's a nice place to sit down and think. Another way you can think about that is when you have a meal, how many total ingredients are on the plate? If you sit down and you have steak, broccoli, cauliflower, and you fry some potatoes, and you maybe fry all that in olive oil, put some salt on it, there are 6 ingredients there. If you sit down and have a slice of bread, you immediately have more than 6 ingredients. So you can see how those foods as they are just them, while as soon as we have a product that's been created by man, there's a lot more to it. And by staying closer to those real foods, we'll stay closer to that list. This week, we're going to speak about that list again, but we're going to speak about how it will help you by being a balanced list. So there are 2 things we're going to speak about. There are micronutrients and there are macronutrients. Micronutrients are things that are present in food but in small amounts. These are things like vitamins and minerals. Macronutrients are things that are present in those foods in large amounts. These are protein, carbohydrate and fat. What we want to try and do with our food and our eating habits is to get a balance of lots of micronutrients and a fair balance across the macronutrients. That will help provide our body with everything it needs, but without any extra things. For the micronutrients, we can see how eating meat and vegetables and nuts and seeds and so on, those have lots of vitamins and minerals naturally in them. Sometimes you might pick up a box of cereal, for example, and it might say they've added iron to that thing. Usually what's happened in that case is that food has been somewhat deprived of nutrition, and so they've artificially added one thing so that they can shout about it. Unfortunately, apples don't have a big marketing team behind them. Apple products do, but apples, the fruit don't. Apples can't shout about all the good things about them. But Kellogg's Rice Krispies can shout in front of the box about how healthy that thing is. A common thing to look for is if you see a food that has a lot of health claims on it, it's probably not that good for you. Then we can look at macronutrients. So the 3 macronutrients that are going to be important here are fat, carbohydrate and protein. Protein is essentially the building blocks for your body, so when you eat something with a lot of protein, your body will break it down and then use those parts to build you back up. Carbohydrate is an energy source for your body. You can eat carbohydrate, or if you don't eat carbohydrate, your body can actually turn protein into carbohydrate. But either way, it has a certain amount that it wants to use every day. And that's going to be important for movement, for brain function, for all of our day-to-day activities. And then fat is also beneficial. It helps some micronutrients like vitamins and minerals absorb into your body, and it's part of your cell is made of fat. You can imagine if you looked at yourself underneath a microscope, all the little bits of your cell are going to be floating about inside of fat. So it's useful for our cells to stay healthy, to eat enough fat. Now also, as you can imagine, fat on your body is important for insulation. If you have no fat on your body, then you're going to get cold easily. If you're incredibly lean, you'd be colder than someone who had excess body fat. So there's a balance to be had there, but we do want to eat all 3 of those macronutrients in a balance. When we look at that list, meat and vegetables, nuts and seeds, some fruit, a little starch, no sugar, we can see that we have a nice even balance across micronutrients because there's such a variety of natural foods that have those micronutrients within them naturally. And there's a balance of macronutrients. So if you think of meat, that's going to be a large protein source. If you eat steak or chicken or fish or name a protein source, that's going to have a lot of protein in it. So our protein box is ticked. If we go into vegetables, you could eat a lot of vegetables but not actually get very much carbohydrate. Vegetables are primarily carbohydrate and water and some fibre. So you could eat loads, but you're not going to get the same amount as if you ate something like fruit. So fruit is a denser source of carbohydrate. If you eat maybe a whole head of broccoli, you might get a little bit of carbohydrate. Whereas if you eat a banana, that might be even more carbohydrate than that whole broccoli, and it's much easier to eat. The other carbohydrate on that list is starch. And when we talk about starch, we're thinking about things like maybe potatoes, sweet potatoes, yams, perhaps rice. Now those represent a larger amount of carbohydrate. But you can see how with that list, vegetables is going to be a small amount of carbohydrate because you'd have to eat so much of it to get a lot of carbohydrate. You'll notice before we talk about fruit, we say some fruit, which means we're going to eat fruit, but maybe less than the amount of vegetables we eat. And then when we look down to starch on that list, you'll notice that it says a little starch. What does that mean? It means less starch than fruit and less fruit than vegetables. So instead of protein being a big P represented by that meat, you can see you get a little bit of carbohydrate from vegetables, a little bit from fruit, and a little bit from starch. So protein's ticked, carbohydrates ticked. And then we look at nuts and seeds. So nuts and seeds will have some protein and some carbohydrate in them, but they will largely be fat sources. So that means we've ticked our protein box, we've ticked our carbohydrate box, and we've ticked our fats box. And then by doing so, we've been balanced across our macronutrients on that list. Okay. So this week's homework is to look at the food that you eat. Last week we were just comparing whole foods versus what we eat, how close is that? This week the goal would be to look at, if you're eating meat and vegetables, nuts and seeds, some fruit, a little starch, no sugar, how much meat are you eating in comparison to vegetables and fruit and starch? And how much meat are you eating in comparison to vegetables, fruit, starch and nuts? And what we're looking for is for our energy requirements to be met, maybe something like 33% at each of those things. That would be an excellent place to start. And you can imagine how balanced that is if we're ticking all of those boxes, but none of them are turned up to 11. Okay. If you're checking that list of food against what you usually eat, you could still consider how balanced is that across all of those meals. If you think about your breakfast, lunch and dinner, do you eat some meat or some protein at each one of those meals? Do you eat some fruit or vegetables or starch at each one of those meals? And do you have some sort of fat source at each one of those meals? And if you have one of those meals that's got a glaring hole in it, so you don't have any protein at all at breakfast, then that's going to be some really low-hanging fruit to look at to start improving your diet. Another benefit, just to circle back on that, with eating balanced across those macronutrients is that you feel full for a long time. If you eat a steak that has some protein and fat in it with, let's say, a potato, because you have that nice blend, you're going to digest it slowly and you'll feel full for a long time. Whereas you know that if you had something that was not a balanced meal, maybe it's just carbohydrate and fat, you could imagine a potato with some butter on it, you could probably eat that and then eat another one. Whereas if we tick all three of those boxes, as well as being healthier because we're giving our body everything that we need, we're also going to feel fuller for longer and not be so tempted to eat additional things. Okay, so to conclude, this week we're saying eating meat and vegetables, nuts and seeds, some fruit, a little starch and no sugar gives us a balance of macronutrients, fat, protein, carbohydrate, and micronutrients, vitamins and minerals. And we want to consider how balanced what we currently eat is against that framework. It doesn't have to be against that exact list, but how does that compare in general? And then that's your thought experiment. Hope that was interesting, gang, for you. If you have any questions, you can always feel free to reach out. Ready? On 3, 1, 2.